This is a presentation introduction to postmodernism. I'm just going to walk you through the 10 elements that we are going to be studying as we read postmodern texts. And this week, we're also going to study or look at those 10 elements with regard to works of art, because artwork and visual imagery is very important to the postmodern period, along with literature. I've given a list, I've provided a list of the 10 elements on the assignment page, and also at the bottom of my classroom page in the materials section, because you'll probably want to use this list of 10 elements and their definitions just as a quick reference as we read. So, just a little bit about the word postmodernism to start. Like it sounds, it is after modernism. Um, so it comes after the modernist era, and it is a reaction to modernism, but it's really a reaction to all of the movements in American literature that come before it that we've already studied. It happens to be my favorite um, movement in American literature. Some people say we're still in the postmodernism period, and some say we've gone beyond it and we're sort of in a postmodern period in American literature, or something that we haven't named. But I'll let you decide as we read and go through our postmodernism unit. So, our first element of postmodernism is opposition to authority. We're going to read some nonfiction texts about history and historical events during the postmodern era, but opposition to authority comes a lot from the Vietnam War era. The American public during and after Vietnam really felt like they had been misled about our involvement in the war, how long we would be there, how deadly it would be to Americans. And what came after that was also the Nixon Watergate scandal. And so that really led people to distrust authority and authority figures. And this has to do with believing in certain truths, and questioning those truths that maybe have been pushed out and pushed on people by authority figures. Postmodern thinkers didn't like that, so they rebelled against authority figures and the truths that they were trying to get people to believe in. The second element is the question of what is truth. So the idea that truth is relative is something that postmodernists believe in. That they thought that there are no impartial truths. So in other words, everyone's perspective really defines their own reality, and they postmodern thinkers believe that we all have very different perspectives based on our very different life experiences, and that therefore we sort of live in different realities. Um, Therefore, they really felt like opinions, if they were rational, could really be the best explanation for a lot of questions, and that there isn't necessarily one truth that applies to everybody. Controversial opinion. Pastiche is the third element, and pastiche uh, really means to mix. It's another word for a type of collage artwork. So if you've made a collage by pasting lots of images together in maybe art class, that is what I think of when I think of pastiche. Now, when that comes to literature, it means that you mix a lot of different genres and forms of writing together. In postmodernism, it could even mean that you make a parody of other literary styles or other movements in American literature. Uh, but it could also just mean that you put them all together and create a new style using all of those different styles from the past. Black humor is another element, that's also called dark comedy or gallows humor. So for gallows humor, you can think of someone at their own execution who is making light of the situation. Um, which has happened in history. That really makes this kind of humor controversial. Some people think that dark humor, in other words, making light of serious subjects, is the funniest kind of humor, but some people are very disturbed by it and think that that's inappropriate. Um, Either way, postmodernists liked it, and they like to push people's buttons a little bit. So that's maybe why they liked black humor. Irony and playfulness, these can be separate or they could sort of be the same thing. Playfulness is a big deal in postmodernism, and it basically has to do with the fact that they believe that things in the world are chaotic, and you just kind of have to play around with the chaos and kind of embrace the chaos of the world. Irony could be playful because it can be funny to be ironic, and kind of play around with nonsense. Or irony can also be used and is used in postmodernism to show how absurd and kind of like nonsensical certain situations are. Metafiction is, I think, the main thing about metafiction is writing about writing. But anything that's meta is analyzing that thing, like one level removed from it. So there's a term in education, for example, called metacognition. So you would be thinking about the process of thinking and how we think. But metafiction is writing about the process of writing. So when you're reading metafiction, it could seem like the narrator, for example, is talking about writing the story as they're writing the story. It could even be a story about writing a story. That sounds very weird and boring, but it's just a little brain teaser, is how I kind of think about metafiction. Paranoia is what it sounds like. It's just distrusting a system, or this goes back to opposition to authority, distrusting authority. Main thing I would say is different between opposition to authority and paranoia is that paranoia doesn't have to be about authority, but if it is about authority, a lot of times there's a real fear of authority. You could hate the government or hate authority and not really be paranoid, but a lot of times they do go together. So another thing that could separate paranoia is that a lot of times in postmodern literature, it involves technology and being fearful of what technology might be doing. Um, that technology might be watching people or manipulating people in some way. Fragmentation is just breaking into small parts or fragments. And this might sound familiar, because the article about comparing postmodernism to modernism from last week talked about grand narratives and how postmodern authors don't like big grand narratives or stories that wrap up in one nice theme. And so they like these little mini narratives or smaller stories that maybe add up, but maybe don't. A lot of times they just don't make any large claim about what is true in the world. That is something that makes postmodernism kind of hard to analyze. So sometimes it's really hard to come up with like a universal theme for a postmodern story. But I think that's where these 10 elements of postmodernism come in, because we can at least analyze the elements and what elements of postmodernism are there, even if we can't come up with a theme. Magical realism is another one that sort of is what it sounds like. It's realism, but with some element of magic in it. So it's an otherwise realistic story that then maybe shifts into something that seems like a dream. Maybe the time shifts around in ways that don't make sense. Maybe there are just mythological elements or fairy tale elements that come in to the story. it's sort of something extra that is outside of, that makes the story not totally realist. And you'll know it when you read it. And our last element is hyperreality. I think about advertising when I think about hyperreality, products and advertising. One way you probably experience advertising a lot is Instagram ads that you can't really sometimes tell the difference between someone's Instagram post and when they are advertising a product to you. So that is something that won't appear in any stories we're reading, but you can think back on, because there are definitely times in stories that we will read where characters are being advertised to, or maybe being influenced by advertising or using products. And you as the reader kind of have to question, like, is this story advertising something to me, or is the narrator trying to advertise something in the story, or what's going on here with that? And that's comes from the fact that postmodernism is involved in this very commercialized period of American history where things were available, like being mass produced, starting to be advertising was starting to be a more important thing, and people started getting a little skeptical of that. So that enters into fiction too. So I'm going to go over 3 examples or samples from a postmodern novel called Catch-22. I'm going to read some excerpts and then just talk about what elements of postmodernism I see in these excerpts. I will say that not all 10 elements will be in these excerpts, and that's because it's very hard to find a postmodern story that has all 10 elements of postmodernism in it. So most things we read will have, I would say, 3 or 4, maybe more elements of postmodernism, but not all. So don't think that you're going to see all 10 elements in every story. So excerpt 1 is about a major in the Army. The whole story, Catch-22, takes place during World War II in the Army. And this major's name is Major. Okay, so I'll read this excerpt. Major had a difficult time from the start. Like Miniver Cheevy, he had been born too late, exactly 36 hours too late, for the physical well-being of his mother, a gentle, ailing woman who, after a full day and a half's agony in the rigors of childbirth, was depleted of all resolve to pursue further the argument over the new child's name. In the hospital corridor, her husband moved ahead with the unsmiling determination of someone who knew what he was about. The fact that he had been born Major was a secret known only to his father. Not until Major was enrolling in kindergarten was the discovery of his real name made. And then the effects were disastrous. The news killed his mother, who just lost her will to live and wasted away and died, which was just fine with his father, who had decided to marry the bad-tempered girl at the A&P if he had to, and who had not been optimistic about his chances of getting his wife off the land without paying her some money or flogging her. Okay, so I'll tell you what I see in this excerpt. There's definitely dark humor because the mother dies and the father basically is fine with that because he had been trying to get rid of her anyway. It's kind of dark. There is some pastiche. It's not exactly that another literary style is used, but they talk about Miniver Cheevy, so they're basically comparing Major to Miniver Cheevy, who we just read about in the poem, which is a modernist poem, and so that the kind of sadness of Miniver Cheevy is referenced, and so this character is kind of based off of him, which is pastiche. And then this is, I would say kind of playful. I don't know if there's out and out irony here, but there's definitely some playfulness with this name because the family name was Major. The dad um, secretly named him Major. And then, by the way, he became a major in the army, which is why he is Major. It's just kind of absurd, and that has to do with playfulness. This is the second excerpt. This doesn't have to do with Major. But it also takes place in the army. And just so you know, the only really important character for the next two slides is Yossarian, who is just an enlisted man in the army, but he's sort of the protagonist of this story. Other things about him aren't so important. So this says there was only one catch, and that was catch 22, which specified that a concern for one's own safety in the face of dangers that were real and immediate was the process of a rational mind, or just another serviceman in the army, or was crazy and could be grounded. All he had to do was ask. And as soon as he did, he would no longer be crazy and would have to fly more missions. Or would be crazy to fly more missions and sane if he didn't. But if he was sane, he had to fly them. If he flew them, he was crazy and didn't have to. But if he didn't want to, he was sane and had to. Yossarian was moved very deeply by the absolute simplicity of this clause of catch 22 and let out a respectful whistle. Now that's some catch, that catch 22, he observed. It's the best there is, Dr. Nika agreed. Yossarian saw it clearly in all its spinning reasonableness. There was an elliptical precision about its perfect pairs of parts that was graceful and shocking, like good modern art. And at times, Yossarian wasn't quite sure that he saw it at all. Just the way he was never quite sure about good modern art or about the flies Orr saw in Appleby's eyes. He had Orr's word to take for the flies in Appleby's eyes. Okay. This is a strange excerpt, but there's definitely irony in it. The whole catch 22 is an ironic situation because it's sort of like a situation that cancels itself out. There's, I would say, definitely an element that of the idea that truth is relative. So they both admire catch 22, but it's also could be a very frustrating thing. There's some black humor in the fact that these two characters even appreciate catch 22 when it's kind of putting people in danger. If you really think about the situation of somebody being mentally unstable and having to fly combat missions. And there's even some magical realism at the end because they just sort of start shifting into talking about flies in a character's eyes. Also, I do think that this contains some metafiction because there's this whole explanation of catch 22, and then Yossarian says that there's an elliptical precision about it, and it's like good modern art. And so he's sort of analyzing the way that the catch is written out and how that seems to be pretty impressive. So there's a lot going on there. Hopefully that makes a bit of sense. And then excerpt 3 is also about Yossarian. So it says the only thing going on was a war, and no one seemed to notice but Yossarian and Dunbar. And when Yossarian tried to remind people, they drew away from him and thought he was crazy. Even Clevinger, who should have known better but didn't, had told him he was crazy the last time they had seen each other, which was just before Yossarian had fled into the hospital. Clevinger had stared at him with apoplectic rage and indignation, and clawing the table with both hands, had shouted, "You're crazy." "They're trying to kill me," Yossarian told him calmly. "No one's trying to kill you," Clevinger cried. "Then why are they shooting at me?" Yossarian asked. "They're shooting at everyone," Clevinger answered. "They're trying to kill everyone. And what difference does that make?" Okay. So Yossarian's in the middle of a war, and he says people are trying to kill him. And so that's a bit of paranoia. on Yossarian's part. On the other hand, it isn't paranoia because they really are shooting at him and trying to kill him because it's the middle of a war. So the fact that Clevenger sees it as paranoia and is meaning that Yossarian is crazy, and Yossarian sees it as totally rational, means that this also is an example of truth being relative. So each of these three excerpts are an example of more than one element of postmodernism, but there are elements I didn't talk about, like hyperreality, for example, isn't really in Catch-22. And that's okay, because we'll also look at these other elements with regards to postmodern art, and we'll work on them as we go through. So I hope that helps explain some of those elements of postmodernism. If that doesn't make total sense or you have questions, that's a good thing. In fact, you are going to give me a question you have about the whole postmodern movement or one of the elements in postmodernism, just as a response to watching this video, so that I can answer those questions either upfront or as we go. All right. Thanks for watching and thinking about what's going on here.